everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to discuss the book, Oil Wealth and Federal Conflicts in American Petrofederations, the critical relationship between oil rents and federal conflicts. This webinar is organized by CEPESP, the Center for Politics and Economics in the Public Sector Studies. My name is Elise Massard da Fonseca. I'm Associate Professor of Public Administration here at FGV, and it's a great honor to open our event today. Today, we're going to have the book organizer, Beni Trojbicz, professor at the Humanities Graduation Program at the Jequitinhonha and Mucuri Valleys Federal University, who will speak about the conceptual framework of the book and moderate the discussions. We also have the honor of welcoming our speakers who have contributed to the chapters on Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. We have João Vitor Marques Cardoso, a researcher at FGV Energia. João Vitor is speaking here today on behalf of Fernanda Delgado, who couldn't be with us today. She had a meeting in Brasilia. Joining him are Professor Carlos Gervasoni, Director and Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Torquato de Tella University in Argentina. We also have Professor Daniel Bellan, Director of the McGill Institute for Studies of Canada and Professor in the Department of Political Science at the McGill University. Professor Daniel will arrive in a few minutes. I would like to thank Beni and the speakers for accepting our invitation to discuss this timely and relevant topic. Before we start, I have some housekeeping information. So please, if you have any questions posted on the Slido platform, you can find the link on the video description here on YouTube. I also need to read a disclaimer that is required by FGV. All statements expressed by Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not FGV's institutional position. Everyone here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will and consented to be recorded in this broadcast. The video will be posted on FGV official YouTube channel. To continue with the streaming, I ask you to express your agreement by nodding your head if you agree to be recorded. Beni, the floor is yours. Let's start our webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Elise. Well, I present myself. I am Beni Trojbicz. I am the editor of the book Oil Wealth and Federal Conflict in American Petrofederations. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like first to thank Professor Massard da Fonseca for the incentive to do the session. Also, I'd like to thank Fundação Getulio Vargas Communication Department for providing support to make that happen. And I'd like to thank the authors, of course, for agreeing to take part on this. So I prepared a little PowerPoint that I would like to show you in order to convey what we're trying to show here. Let me, I am more used to using Meet rather than Zoom, so excuse my lack of ability here. Well, the objective of this presentation is to describe the model that guided the crafting of the case studies. And first of all, I think it's important to realize that oil wealth may sum up to a significant part of public revenue. And when oil wealth is inside federal systems, you may create intergovernmental dynamics that will determine how sizable resources are allocated. And the outcome of this relation impacts the political economy of a country. This is sometimes known as resource curves or as Dutch disease. We may talk about that later if needed in the Q&A session. But in the short term, you may impact the government's ability to manage macroeconomic and budgetary fluctuations, while in the long term, this relationship may impact regional equity, as normally oil wealth is concentrated in parts of the territory, but as well social and intergenerational equity. However, this relationship remains largely unexplored until then, maybe because both oil political economy and federalism feature sheer diversity, rendering the context very, very specific. So the challenge of this volume was to develop a mid-range theory that would allow for a higher level of generalization. In order to do that, we developed, based on this introductory chapter that was published beforehand with foreign federations, we developed the explanatory variables, which are themselves an effort to generate the generalization that's specific to the causal relationship. So this specific part of the webinar will have a larger study sample. Besides the 6 American federations, we also have countries from Africa, from Asia, and Australia itself that were studied in order to develop those variables. So what we are going to do is a brief overview of the dependent variable and the independent variables that guided the study as benchmarks for the next presentations. So talking about the dependent variable, which are the types of oil-related federal conflicts, the first important thing to realize is that we have 3 relevant actors, which are the producing jurisdictions, the ones where the oil extraction is located, or whenever it's an offshore exploration that are near the exploration, the union and non-producing jurisdictions. And to get to the types of oil-related federal conflicts, we went through 3 main questions. The first one is whether there is a conflict, because there may be no conflict. That would be a sort of cooperation. Then, if there is a conflict, we may analyze whether the conflict is between the same level of government, which are the jurisdictions, states, or provinces, depending on the country, or if the conflict is between the union and the producing jurisdictions. So in the case you have this sort of vertical conflict, you may have the preferences of the jurisdiction prevailing or the union prevailing. And that would lead to this table shows the outcome of the different countries. There's a caveat because time matters. You may have a certain type of conflict at one point, which would change, as it happened, for instance, in Brazil. We had a horizontal conflict in the 2010s and the late 80s, witnessed a different kind of conflict. Regarding the types of conflict, we found cooperation in the US and Australia, and the things those cases have in common is the fact that you have sectors that are very market oriented. In the Australian case, actually, you have a concerted regulation between unions and all the jurisdictions. Then the horizontal pattern was found in both Brazil and Nigeria. And what they had in common is that the union distances itself from the conflict, leaving more space for the conflict among jurisdictions. The only country that had a vertical conflict with the jurisdiction prevailing was Canada, and all the other countries had vertical conflicts with the union prevailing. And that may be accounted to the fact that those countries have very centralized federal systems. Moving into the independent variables, we gathered three kinds of independent variables. The first one would be the oil rents decentralization, the second, the oil sector importance, and finally, the oil rents in the federal redistributive policy. Those are the variables that were perused in the chapters in order to describe what was going on in the countries. Regarding the oil rent decentralization, the first element that was taken care of is resources property. If you have a decentralized resource property to the producing jurisdiction, then claims from the union or from non-producing jurisdictions are much less legitimate. However, when you have the sector management centralized, you may turn it upside down, which happened specifically in Malaysia. You have the Petronas, which is the national oil company that's very centralized, and it was able to manage some decentralized resource property. And finally, the distribution of revenues is important as well, because the way the revenues are distributed among the jurisdictions may tease more or less non-producing jurisdictions that are maybe not receiving resources to go into federal conflict. Regarding oil sector importance, there are two elements to think about. The first one is national importance and then subnational. Invariably, you have the oil sector is important subnational. But in national terms, it will depend a lot on how the oil sector relates to the national economy. I think that the most evident case would be the US. You have a huge oil sector, but this sector is not that important in related to the whole economy. And if you compare that to the case of Nigeria, in Nigeria, you have a much smaller oil sector, but it's much more important to the country. Well, finally, the way oil rents are used as a redistributive federal policy matters as well. And there are three elements to this. The first one is the fiscal federal imbalance, which means how much do the jurisdictions rely on unions' money to finance themselves? The more they rely on unions' money, the more they will be willing to get some extra money. And then as well, you may find an important role in the federal government equalizing effect, how much the federal government will try to equalize resources across jurisdictions. And finally, the way oil revenues are used for regional equity purposes. That was all. I think that we will have very interesting case presentations, first with Argentina, then Brazil, and we are still waiting for Daniel. If he arrives, we will be able to see Canada as well. Thank you. Well, now we move to the Argentinian presentation. Carlos, you are already presented by Lizzie. I will just mention again that you are the Director of Department of Political Science and International Studies in the Universidad Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Beni. Thank you for organizing this panel and more generally for the project. It's really interesting and important, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Thank you to the Fundação Getulio Vargas. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to just highlight a few elements that I think make the Argentinian case interesting or different in some way from the other cases. You know, one way in which Argentina is not especially interesting is that it's a relatively small economy compared to most of the other economies that Beni was covered and that are covered in the book. And its oil sector is not especially large. It might be large soon because Argentina is developing some unconventional oil and gas in the Vaca Muerta reservoir, but so far it's I would say an intermediate producer and exporter of oil, certainly a lot smaller than the US or Canada or Mexico. It used to be a lot smaller than Venezuela, not now because of the decline in production in Venezuela. But I think the case itself has some interesting lessons for the topic of the book and the general issue of federalism and conflict regarding rents, regarding oil rents and potentially any other types of rents. Argentina is definitely not a big player in the international markets of oil. It might have an opportunity to become one should Argentina be able to exploit oil and gas reserves in the Vaca Muerta play, which for those of you who are not familiar with it is a relatively new, relatively newly exploited reservoir in the province of Neuquén, mostly in the Patagonian, in the west of the Patagonian, bordering with Chile, also covering parts of the provinces of Mendoza, Rio Negro, and La Pampa. The second issue I wanted to mention, which is related to the the fact that Vaca Muerta has not been fully exploited, is that Argentina has been in general very famous or infamous for its very volatile politics and economics. Very volatile, I have to say. Even for Latin American standards, Argentina has had very sudden changes in political and economic orientation and a very volatile pattern of economic development, or should I say undevelopment, right? I mean, Argentina used to be possibly the most advanced economy of Latin America by far in the 50s or 60s, not so anymore. It has stagnated, and it is a country that has very poor indicators of things like inflation, like just to give people who might not be familiar with Argentina an idea, Argentina is now running at 150% inflation rate per year, 40% poverty rate in a country that used to be quite rich. So this volatility in growth rates, inflation, exchange rate levels, etc., has certainly not been good for the country, has certainly not been good for the oil sector. This volatility means that investment in oil is risky, like any other investment that implies sinking large amounts of capital in a country. Investing oil in a lot of the developing world is risky. It is certainly risky in Argentina. There is a risk of expropriation like everywhere else, although that hasn't been the main problem in Argentina. There are many regulatory risks. Right now, the price of fuel, for example, the domestic price of fuel is regulated, heavily regulated by the government. The exports of oil and gas are taxed by the Argentine government. the provinces also take royalties. So basically, it's a sector that is heavily taxed and in a volatile way. You know, governments may change its regulatory environment towards the oil industry in sharp and important ways. One element I just mentioned, and I want to point out in my presentation because it's different in Argentina, is the fact that Argentina relies very, very heavily on export taxes for its public finances. In a world that generally encourages taxes and encourages exports and tries to promote exports, Argentina has had historically, this is something that comes from at least from the 40s and the rise of Perón to power in the mid 40s, a very productive primary sector, mostly the rich agricultural areas of the Pampas that have been on and off taxed and otherwise exploited by governments to obtain rents from the agricultural sector. But more recently, Argentina has not only started to rely on agricultural on taxes on agricultural exports, but also on taxes on mineral exports and oil and gas exports. During the 90s, when we had the Menem administration here, Menem being a Peronist who implemented the whole set of Washington consensus policies in Argentina, these taxes were done away with. So for 10 years, Argentina had price stability and had a very friendly investment climate towards any sort of domestic or private or foreign investment in any business sector. There was a boom in oil and gas investment, and the production of the country grew, and Argentina actually became a relatively significant exporter of oil and gas to countries such as Chile and Uruguay and Brazil. In the 2000s, after our big crisis of 2001, the policies changed completely, and the government started taxing exports of oil and gas, especially in moments of high prices. This means that the sector became a relatively important funder of Argentina's chronically underfunded federal government. The importance of the sector in terms of public finances is, I would say, moderate, not super large. It was relatively important a few years ago, not so important now, precisely because exports have been declining in volume, and actually Argentina became a net importer over the last few years of hydrocarbons, but it's likely to go up again. Like most other countries, the most important taxes in Argentina are the VAT and income tax and a few other taxes. But when you take all of these export taxes together, they may well be between 10 and 15% of all the federal revenues in the country, and a significant part of that is mineral and oil export taxes. For provinces, however, the oil sector can be very, very important in some of them, especially Neuquén and other Patagonian provinces that I'm going to mention in a minute. I'm going to share screen just for a minute and show you one slide from the book. This is a graph that appears in the chapter that Mauricio Grotz and myself wrote for the book. And what you see here is the 24 subnational units in Argentina. Argentina has 23 provinces and the city of Buenos Aires. And what you see here is the revenues of the provinces and the city of Buenos Aires that are of its own. What is missing here to get to 100% is federal transfers, right? So most provinces rely heavily on federal transfers for their financing. But the dark part of these columns that you see are revenues coming from oil and gas royalties. So in the province of Neuquén, which I mentioned before as the main place in which the Vaca Muerta reservoir is located, about 35% of its revenues come from oil royalties. Almost the same for the province of Chubut and Santa Cruz, which are the two provinces to the south of Neuquén. And Rio Negro and Mendoza, which are bordering provinces with Neuquén to the east and north, also have relatively important oil revenues. Tierra del Fuego, which is our southernmost province in the south of Patagonia, also relatively important royalties, although most of these come from gas more than oil. If in years of high prices and if production in Vaca Muerta increases, and it is starting to increase over the last few years, one would expect that a province like Neuquén will become basically a rentier state, a subnational rentier state. This has been a concept that I have been playing with. We all are familiar with the concept of rentier states, but in Argentina we have subnational rentier states, partly because of this phenomenon, because some provinces capture very significant oil rents, but also because some provinces capture very significant fiscal federalism rents. I call them that way. It means basically subsidies that go to provinces through federal transfers, right? So money that provinces receive that goes far beyond what they would receive if they collected their own taxes, right? So you have provinces in the south, but especially in the north, that receive huge subsidies because what they contribute to the national, tax revenues is quite low, but what they receive in federal tax transfers is very high. So you have something like an oil emirate, but without oil. Basically, a lot of money accruing to the provincial government of that province, say Formosa or La Rioja in the north of Argentina, turning them into rentier states. And a political consequence of that, which I'm just going to mention briefly, but it's a big part of my research, is that these rentier states, either based on oil or on fiscal federalism, tend to be less democratic than the rest of the provinces in Argentina. What is, I think, very significant and quite different in terms of the main focus of the book, in the case of Argentina, is the relatively low level of conflict. I mean, when Ben invited me to write this chapter, I had to start thinking more about this because, thinking historically, in spite of all the volatility I mentioned, conflict between the national and subnational levels or among the provinces has been relatively unimportant. Moreover, I would say that conflict among the provinces is basically absent, which is an anomaly, right? I mean, if you think about it, all royalties in Argentina go to the producing provinces, which means that these provinces I was just showing you, Neuquén and Chubut and Santa Cruz, are appropriating 100%, not of oil rents, because the federal government also takes part of it in terms of the income tax and export taxes, but of what we call royalties, regalías petroleras in Spanish. They go 100% to the provincial government of the producing province. So there is nothing shared with the nation, nothing shared with the other provinces, and nothing shared with the municipalities. And, you could expect that some of those governments could make claims on this relatively important, amount of fiscal resources. I expect that if Vaca Muerta comes to be, eventually becomes a very, very important producing play, then the size of the royalties accruing to the province of Neuquén will be so big that it will become prominent in the agenda and it will become tempting for other jurisdictions to try to get a part of it. And when I say other jurisdictions, I mean all of the ones I mentioned, maybe the national government, maybe other provinces. In other countries, royalties are distributed with non-producing provinces too, and by the municipal governments, especially the municipal governments of the producing areas. In terms of the vertical conflict, there has been vertical conflict, not very acute, and I think this is also interesting. And I think part of the reason is because of this volatility. Conflicts never have enough time to develop, to unfold. This is interesting because if you see the volatility of policy in Argentina, to some extent it follows price volatility of international prices of oil, right? So, for example, when prices fall, as it was the case during the COVID pandemic, the government actually establishes a floor, a price floor of about $40 per barrel when the price of oil was, going to almost zero, right? And this was a way of shielding provinces, a way of shielding provinces from the fiscal effect of not collecting any royalties, because if the price of oil goes to zero, then the royalties also go to zero. And when the prices go above, say, $60 or $70, then the government not only stops with the price floor, which doesn't make any sense anymore, but starts charging export taxes. And therefore, the government has like two different mechanisms to appropriate oil revenues or oil rents. One is the income tax on the companies, and the other one is export taxes. And then there is still one more way, which is the tax on fuels, which anybody buying fuel in Argentina will pay at the pump, right? So, but export taxes are something that the government has complete control of because, and this is very controversial, it's not defined as a tax and therefore does not need a congressional approval. It's basically a measure that the government takes by decree, is considered to be part of the capacity that the national government has to regulate foreign trade. So both taxes on imports and taxes on exports are done by decree in Argentina, and there has been some challenges to that, because if they were defined as taxes, then they would have to be approved by Congress. But so far, the government, the national government, has been able to get away with this, which means that basically it can appropriate a very, very significant share of oil revenues when the prices of oil are high. One important characteristic of this is that, like most federations or all federations, Argentina has a revenue sharing system. So the income tax is actually shared with the provinces. Roughly speaking, about half of the income tax remains in federal hands, and the other half is co-participated, is shared with the provinces. The exports on tax, the taxes on exports of oil or anything else are not shared, are 100% appropriated by the federal government. So it's an especially tempting fiscal resource for a state that is chronically facing fiscal deficits like the Argentinian federal state. So that conflict, in which actually the national government can take a big part of these revenues, has been relatively unimportant. And I think a few explanations for that is, first, that the affected provinces are only a few. The affected resources are not that large. They are large for the provinces, but not that large for the country as a whole. And because the federal government is very powerful in Argentina vis-a-vis individual provinces. I was taking a look at Beni's slide on this, on what was the result of the conflicts in other countries of the world. And I think the most common outcome is that the union prevails, right? Well, in that sense, it looks like Argentinian subnational units are so vulnerable to any retaliation from the national government that can come in many ways, that they may prefer to not to put up a big conflict regarding this, especially when the affected provinces will be only a few and relatively small provinces in terms of population. Therefore, it's a difficult conflict to win. So more than you could think of Argentina as a case of a union, of a conflict won by the union, of a vertical conflict won by the union. You could think of it as a non-existing horizontal conflict won by the producing provinces, because the producing provinces are every day keeping all of the oil royalties for themselves, and they may not want to, so to speak, make waves, given that the current state of affairs is relatively convenient for those provinces. And I don't expect any big changes in Argentina's levels of conflict over the next years, unless, and again, I'm going to say this maybe for the fourth time, Vaca Muerta booms, and there might be a boom in Vaca Muerta. I'm going to just close by saying that all of this policy volatility that I was mentioning from the beginning of my presentation is also accompanied by an exogenous volatility, which is very natural to this industry. Prices are very volatile in the oil sector, and also by an endogenous political volatility. Argentina has been, partly because of its very poor development record, changing governments all the time, and we went from neoliberalism in the 90s to populism in the 2000s, and then the Kirchners lost the elections in 2015, and we had this more pro-business administration of Macri, and then the 2019 election brought back the Peronists with a populist, statist approach, and now we're having elections this year, and both the provincial government of Neuquén and the national government either changed or are expected to change. In Neuquén, something very interesting happened. The same party was ruling Neuquén since democracy came back to Argentina in 1983, and that party lost the elections just a couple of months ago. And there will be a new administration which is a complex and heterogeneous alliance of different forces, which is very difficult to predict what its take on oil will be once they come to power in December. And the national government, the Peronist national government, is expected to lose the elections, primary elections in August and general elections in October. So if that happens, and if there was some kind of political configuration more friendlier towards investment in Vaca Muerta, then Vaca Muerta may actually come to be a very important reservoir and a very important source of production and export for Argentina. And then I would expect that with a more interesting level of rents, both vertical and horizontal conflict might become a lot bigger than what we have had so far. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, it's a great presentation, Carlos. Thank you very much. The Argentinian case is so interesting because there's this combination of subnational ownership and a very powerful center. And this is so complex. And I'm always interested on what's going on in that case. Well, now we'll move to Brazil. João Vitor Marques Cardoso, welcome. João is a researcher at the Center for Energy Studies of the Getulio Vargas Foundation here in Brazil. João, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beni. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this project. I'd like to thank my co-authors of Brazilian chapter, Fernanda Delgado from the Brazilian Institute for Oil and Gas, and Vitor Gaspar, who is from the Brazilian Naval College. I especially like to thank Professor Fernanda Delgado for trusting me to replace her today. Thank you all for this opportunity. Well, I have the challenge to present Brazil. So I will present a brief overview, and then I will talk a little bit about the oil rents decentralization in the country, as well the oil importance for the union and jurisdictions, and the whole of oil rents in redistributive policies in the country. So a brief overview: Brazil currently is the largest oil producing country in Latin America. oil and gas sector share at least 15% of industrial GDP. And by 2030, oil production is estimated to reach around 5 million barrels per day, and it can contribute with more than $600 billion of revenues in the coming 10 years. So when we talk about oil rents decentralization, we need to highlight that the ownership of oil reserves belongs to the union, the federal sphere of power. This ownership belongs to the union since the 50s, with the approval of the first law concerned with the oil policy. But liberal reforms in the 90s seized the state monopoly on exploration and production of oil, but both the Constitution and the petroleum law states that oil and gas fields belongs to the union. Then national and international companies shall bid oil and gas fields through auctions. Union is also responsible for the sector management through the regulator and the centralization of revenues. The regulation by the National Agency for Oil and Gas and Biofuels is committed to holding bidding rounds and promoting rules for production, quality norms, standards for fuels, also trade activities, and supervising the regulatory compliance. And regarding revenues, union collects government participations, such as signature bonuses, royalties, special participations, that is a windfall profit, and fees over the occupation of the area and other tax obligations like the income tax. Well, after that, the collection by the union, these royalties and special participations are shared mostly with producing jurisdictions. Although union is responsible to collect revenues, producing jurisdictions concentrate gains, while non-producing jurisdictions receive only marginal funds, and unions' gains are mostly divided among the Navy Command and the Ministry of Science, and also the social fund that finance education, healthcare services. Well, producing jurisdictions obviously prefer the decentralization of oil revenues due to the economic freedom of investing and public services provided. Although poorest jurisdictions, non-producing jurisdictions tend to struggle for the equitable transfers from the union. These opposed perspectives foster federative conflicts between producing and non-producing jurisdictions, and it reviews the importance and dependence of producing jurisdictions, producing states and municipalities on oil sector. So oil sector is quite important for producing jurisdictions because royalties' economic impacts have been analogous to that of a tax. Although royalties are considered a compensatory revenue, currently the economic impact is analogous to that of a tax. Oil rents have guaranteed a fiscal situation and and public investments in producing jurisdictions. So a decline of oil prices or production would impact the economic situation. We have a good example from the state of Rio de Janeiro that in last year in 2022, the state collected almost 31 billion reais of oil rents. And this represents almost 1/3 of total revenues of the state. But in 2016, when oil prices averaged around $40 per barrel, the state of Rio de Janeiro collects 3 billion reais. This is 10 times less than what was collected last year. So this jurisdiction is face oil prices volatility and oil volatility on oil production. But not only prices volatility impact the budget of this oil producing state, but also possible change on oil production, on oil distribution, sorry, because a shift on this framework would wreck the budget and the capacity of these states and municipalities of providing public services. In Brazil, only 3 states, Rio, São Paulo, and Espírito Santo, share above 2% of Brazilian oil production. It means that all the other states has less than 2% of Brazilian oil production. And this state have a quarter of lower chamber Congress people. So they struggle to keep the current framework of distribution. Such political elites are benefit from the current fiscal structure, assuming that oil revenues collection and distribution are core elements for the electoral process. There have been some shifts in rates, even across producing jurisdictions. We have seen the pre-salt reserves shifting, the producing in Brazil shifting from the Campos Basin to Santos Basin due to the fields of pre-salt. So the largest volume of royalties, even in the state of Rio de Janeiro, is migrating to other municipalities. We may say in Niterói, in Maricá, the municipalities in the state of Rio that receives most of the revenues. And now other cities, like other towns like Campos dos Goytacazes, are receiving less revenues. So in the sense, the greater the importance of revenue, the more conflicts concerning oil wealth distribution can happen, because Brazil has a lot of regional inequalities in terms of social and economic inequalities. So it's important to understand as well how oil rents influence the redistributive policy in the country. Fiscal federalism has the intention of achieving the fiscal balance and equalization across subnational jurisdictions to guarantee national development and poverty eradication, reduction of social inequalities as well. So fiscal federalism in Brazil is featured with the central government's strong capacity of collecting revenues, while the local government has the strong capacity of revenue allocation. So it's different, this whole. It raises imbalances between different power levels, that is the vertical fiscal imbalance, requiring transfers from the federal sphere to fill fiscal gaps. And however, there are also horizontal fiscal imbalances across the subnational jurisdictions that requires the fiscal equalization. It means that the transfer needs to ensure standards of public services throughout jurisdictions. In Brazil, some transfers for redistributive transfers are intended to fiscal equalization, where we may say municipalities participation funds and the states participation fund. But also we can mention the healthcare system, the transfer for the healthcare system, the SUS, and Fundeb as well, that is the funding for education. All of them have this, are committed to fill these fiscal gaps. However, local and regional differences in Brazil reflect a continuous social and economic tensions between the northern regions compared to the southern regions. Remember, the north and northeast region has a disparity from the social and economic disparity compared to south and southeast region. In this sense, political tensions regarding oil rents have risen. Currently, oil rents have a marginal impact on redistributive policy in Brazil regarding non-producing jurisdictions, since some mechanisms like the oil special funds that is distributed to all municipalities and state jurisdictions depends on a small rate of offshore royalties. And today, most of Brazilian oil rents come from the special participation. So perhaps this oil special fund that was set up in the 80s is out of date. So to some final remarks, I would like to present a case study we have analyzed. And in this case study, we point out that the conflict on oil wealth distribution was boosted by the production of pre-salt reserves. The bill signed into a law in 2012 that forces the government to share oil rents on more equally way to the other 24 states and more than 5,000 municipalities in Brazil has contributed to enhancing this conflict. But non-producing states wanted to get access to resources, even on existing oil production, even on oil agreements. In that time, President Dilma Rousseff rejected the original bill to ensure that only rents from future oil contracts would be shared. But after that, the Congress overturned the veto of President Dilma. Now, producing states brought this case to the Supreme Court to be declared unconstitutional, and the decision of only one minister, Carmen Lúcia, suspended the effect of the law. But today, 10 years later, this issue still depends on the decision from all the court ministers. So we are seeing a case study in Brazil that oil rents are quite important for producing jurisdictions, especially Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and this have boosted conflicts in the country, and the main factor for that is the large increase of production from the pre-salt reserves. And now this conflict may return, since we are seeing a large portion of revenues from due to the price, due to the increase of prices in the barrel of oil. So this is my contribution. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, João. This was a great update. Brazil, well, it was the country I started studying, and this is very interesting what's going on right now, because we already reached the 3 million barrels level of production, and the government take is increasing tremendously. So it's very interesting to see what's going on, because now what we have seen is this conflict between cities, and it's all stopped there in the Supreme Court. So I think that there will be some interesting developments of the matter in the next few years. Well, thank you. Well, now I'm glad to welcome Danielle Belin. Danielle is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University, Canada. We are all glad you made it. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beni, for the invitation. And yes, I was able to free myself from an administrative meeting that lasted too long. And I'm really glad to be with you this afternoon. I want to say first that this chapter was a work of love, but done in collaboration with two other scholars, André Lecourt from University of Ottawa and Nicolas Brassard-Dion, who is a former student at the University of Ottawa, who now works for the federal government. Canada, of course, is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. It started as a pretty centralized country in many ways, but over time, and there were some back and forth between Ottawa and the provinces, the country, especially after the Second World War, became more decentralized. This is a complex trajectory, and I won't talk about it in great detail, because the focus, of course, today of our discussion is about oil policy. So a major shift in terms of Canadian federalism and the Canadian economy was the discovery of oil in Leduc, Alberta in 1947. When we talk about oil in Canada, it's concentrated really in Alberta and to a lesser extent in Saskatchewan, which is also in Western Canada in the prairies. And the third largest oil producer after Alberta, which is by far the biggest in Saskatchewan, is Newfoundland and Labrador. But this is mainly about offshore oil. And it's, again, quite smaller than what you see in Alberta. In terms of federal oil policy in this country, there are several important moments and transformations that we've seen over the last 70 years. So first, in early 1960s, we saw the national oil policy where Ontario and the Western provinces became protected markets for Canadian oil. An even more important really turning point in federal oil policy came in the early 1980s with the National Energy Program, which imposed a lower oil price for Canadian oil than the world oil price. And also it added new federal oil royalties and taxes. But this system was very controversial, especially out west in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and was dismantled by the following government. So the National Energy Program was enacted under Pierre Trudeau, the father of our current Prime Minister, Justin, so a liberal government. And when the progressive conservatives took power in 1984, after that, they removed price control on domestic production. They eliminated special federal taxes on oil. They abolished restrictions on export taxes. And also they privatized Petro-Canada, which was a public enterprise created a decade earlier. So really some privatization of much of the oil policy at the time. Another important aspect of this market turn is the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States in 1989 that really further institutionalized the free market approach to oil. And it specified that Canada could not restrict energy export to the United States or impose export taxes on oil sold to the United States. So very important. And after that, of course, with NAFTA, this logic was further extended. In terms of resource property, right? If you look at the Canadian Constitution, Article 109 of the British North American Act, which was later strengthened by Article 92A of the Constitutional Act 1982. Oil, in terms of oil that's in the soil, not offshore oil, is provincial property, right? And offshore oil is different because the federal government has power to explore and exploit it, although agreements, bilateral agreements between Ottawa and some provinces, and we've seen that with Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, allow for the provinces, of course, to play a central role in terms of exploiting offshore oil. But you need to bargain with the federal government for that, which is not the case, of course, when we talk about oil that's underground, which the provinces own. In terms of provincial ownership, it's important to understand that some provinces did not have full control over their natural resources right away after they were created. That was the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan that were created in 1905, and they will only get full ownership of their natural resources in 1930. So there were some struggles with the federal government over this, so that all the provinces can really own their in-ground natural resources, including oil, something that will become, of course, much more important after the Second World War. Obviously, provinces have expectations that the distribution of oil revenues will follow constitutional ownership, and that's been the case. The federal government can impose, theoretically can impose a federal tax on oil, but it has not done that since the National Energy Program in the early 1980s, a program that was highly controversial and that was dismantled, as I said earlier, in the mid-1980s. When you talk about the importance of the oil sector in Canada, Canada is the fourth largest exporter of crude oil in the world right now. And most of its production, most of our production in Canada ends up in the United States. That's why the 1989 Free Trade Agreement is so important here. Canada has some of the largest oil reserves on the planet. And if you look at crude oil production, in 2018, Alberta accounted for 82% of it. So Alberta is really by far the biggest oil producer in the country. Saskatchewan is the second largest province, I said earlier, with 11% of national production. And then when you talk about Newfoundland and Labrador, we talk only about 5% of oil production. So if you take just these three provinces together, you're at 98% of national production. So production is really concentrated geographically. It means that most of the provinces don't have much oil, or their level of oil production is really tiny or non-existent. An important aspect, and that was discussed just before regarding Brazil, is fiscal federalism. In Canada, it's clear that currently, and it's been the case for a long time, Alberta is the richest province. It has the highest fiscal capacity in the country, and it is largely related to the fact that it's by far the biggest player in terms of oil production. And when oil prices go up, and we saw that in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw oil prices going up rapidly, and that, of course, helped Alberta, that suddenly, after years of difficulties financially, ended up with a very large budget surplus. Because, again, provinces own the royalties over oil, and for Alberta, of course, changes in oil prices are dramatic in terms of their impact on the fiscal capacity of the province. And of course, it's a boom and bust cycle. But when it's booming, when oil prices are high, the province goes to the bank and they benefit greatly. So we have important horizontal fiscal discrepancies in Canada, in part because oil is distributed across the country in such an uneven way. So provinces that have, that exploit a lot of oil, especially Alberta, are richer than others. They have a higher fiscal capacity, and that plays a role when the time comes to distribute money to poorer provinces through our federal equalization system. According to this system that was created in 1957, only provinces that are below the national average in terms of fiscal capacity can receive equalization payments from the federal government. Of course, because of all its oil wealth, Alberta has been excluded from equalization payments since natural resources were brought in the calculation of the equalization formula in the early 1960s. So theoretically, all the provinces can receive equalization payment when they are their fiscal capacity falls below the national average. But because of its oil wealth, Alberta is always, or has been always, above this national average since the early 1960s, and therefore doesn't receive equalization payments. Currently, other oil-producing provinces, so the two main ones I mentioned, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, they don't receive equalization payments, but in the near future, it's possible that Newfoundland and Labrador will receive equalization payments again. But you have some provinces that are not meaningful oil-producing provinces, like Quebec or New Brunswick. These provinces, or Manitoba, these provinces have always received equalization. They have received equalization payments nonstop since 1957, and they are unlikely to stop receiving equalization payments anytime soon. And this is a major source of contention, especially in Alberta, because, of course, there is a sense that Alberta is contributing directly to equalization payments because Albertans pay more taxes per capita to the federal government because they are richer on average, but Alberta doesn't receive any equalization payments from the federal government. Of course, Alberta does receive federal transfers for healthcare, for social services, and so forth. But in terms of equalization, it's not the case. And this is a source of contention out west. And that is a very important issue politically. There was even in 2021 a referendum in Alberta over equalization. The premier of the province at the time, Jason Kenney, asked Albertans whether they wanted equalization to be removed from the 1992 Constitution. And a majority of people who voted on that day answered yes. But this, of course, referendum had no real constitutional impact. A province cannot amend the Constitution on its own regarding something as important as the federal equalization principle. But there is still a lot of discontent and criticism of the equalization system in Alberta. And it's directly related to the idea of really oil wealth and the fact that, other provinces are not always supporting pipeline projects, are not always are supporting policies that go against what is perceived as the economic interest of Alberta. The same thing for the federal government. So equalization has become a major political football, in a way, in this struggle between Alberta and both the federal government and some provinces like Quebec. And so really, oil policy is a central aspect of intergovernmental relations in Canada. And when we do look at the case study that really is a part of our chapter, to end with that, we take the example of pipeline politics in Canada since the advent of the Liberal Justin Trudeau government at the federal level in 2015. This being really a major struggle between Alberta and the federal government, but also some other provinces over the approval of key pipeline projects in the context of the debate over how to fight climate change. And certainly there is a tension between oil-producing provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan and non-oil producing provinces like British Columbia and Quebec, and also a tension between the federal government, which is currently, of course, a Liberal government, and the government in Saskatchewan, which is currently under the control of the United Conservative Party of Alberta, which is a pro-oil party that is very critical of the federal government and its environmental policies. But something that adds to the complexity of this debate over federalism and the transportation of oil policy in Canada is the central role of Indigenous peoples in oil politics. Because of the role of courts and what we call in Canada reconciliation, the growing role of Indigenous peoples in policy consultations and policy development, there is a duty to consult Indigenous peoples over major pipeline projects that cross their territory. And this is enforced by the courts, and this has created a lot of tensions and between the Alberta and the federal government. And this is something that is likely to continue for the years to come, because Indigenous peoples, their voice now is stronger than ever before in terms of the development of natural resources, and provinces have to now discuss with Indigenous peoples, so directly, like Alberta and Saskatchewan are doing that, Newfoundland and Labrador as well. But the federal government has the most central role to play when we talk about Indigenous peoples. Really, Indigenous peoples in a way are, some people had an Indigenous scholar at our university yesterday who gave a talk and called them federal peoples, right? They are really under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so when you have tensions over the development of pipeline projects that involve Indigenous peoples, then necessarily the federal government is involved. And that triggers, of course, more tension in terms of intergovernmental relations in Canadian oil policy. I think I've spoken just enough time, Beni. I hope I didn't go over time, but I will give the microphone back to you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the presentation. It was great to hear you authors alive. It is very interesting, and I want to go back to my presentation because with those three countries, we really had a sample of the diversity that oil political economy by one side and federalism by the other gives to the the challenge of generating generalization so we could understand and theorize this issue better. As we're done with the presentations, I think that now we may turn into our questions and answers. I see there is a question to Carlos, and I will take the questions as they will be sent to me in the chat, all right? Carlos, how likely is that as the production of the Vaca Muerta play grows, the federal government and the rest of the provinces attempt to grab part of the royalties accruing to the province of Neuquén? This is something you already covered in your presentation, but maybe could advance on that. And I would like to add a few things. First of all, the case of Australia shows that there is no conflict regarding oil, but there is conflict regarding iron, and iron is much more important to the Australian economy than oil. So this is one thing. And the second thing is that we have the example of Rio here in Brazil. We had a tremendous increase from the late 90s until 2010 of oil revenues, and that increase multiplied by many times so far. So what before was not that question, it became a fierce dispute in Congress. So maybe Neuquén could be thought of as the Rio de Janeiro of Argentina. So I have those two elements that may add up to the question that came from the audience.
All right, so I think it is very likely that if the rents generated by mostly Neuquén become a lot larger than now, there will be conflict. For that, we need awareness, right? I mean, I'm a political scientist, I think like many people here, and potential conflicts don't become conflicts until somebody politicizes them, right? So so far, this issue of oil royalties has been relatively under the radar in Argentina. I think partly because the money at stake is not that much. If suddenly this became a big part of the news, and the public and the rest of the provinces and the public in the rest of the provinces becomes aware of this, there might be a politicization of the issue. I think a vertical conflict would be more likely. It's hard for me to make predictions. We're almost certain to make mistakes when we try to predict the future. But if I had to apply some theories to what I would expect, first I would say that vertical conflict is almost inevitable, or at least some kind of union takeover of the revenues of Neuquén, because the asymmetry there is so large that I think it would be very unlikely for a federal government thirsty for fiscal revenues not to try to do something about that, especially if it was a government on the, I would say, statist, populist side of Argentinian politics. Those governments have been very, very aggressive in taking over the resources of provinces in many ways, not just oil, in many other ways. So I think there will be some kind of attempt of the federal government to capture those rents, and there might not be conflict because Neuquén may not just do anything about it. But if there is conflict, likely the federal government will win. As regards to the rest of the provinces, that is a little, I'm not so sure about that. And the reason for that is when you take into account all natural resources, Beni, you were mentioning iron, Argentina has a few other provinces that have relatively significant mining resources. So I mentioned about 5 that have significant oil and gas resources relative to their economies. And then you can add like 5 more that are important in terms of copper, lithium, which is becoming a big thing, in the world economy. And as you probably know, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, and Australia, but in this part of the world, Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina own about half of the known reserves of lithium, and that's becoming a booming business. And so if you put together the provinces that own large reserves of copper, gold, silver, lithium, oil, gas, then you have like 10, almost 12, which is half. And those provinces may be conservative in this way, right? Like, we never know. Why are we going to politicize this topic when tomorrow they may come for us, right? So, we have those provinces are small and underpopulated, but they are very well represented in the Senate, right? Because we're a federation in which each province has the same number of senators in the Senate, like in most federations. So they're powerful, and they have a relatively powerful capacity to block initiatives in Congress. And this will have to be a law, even more than a law, maybe a constitutional reform, because as Beni was mentioning, Argentina is very decentralized in some aspects of oil ownership and regulation, but especially ownership. And the 1994 constitution, Argentina reformed this constitution in 1994, and that reform gave clear property of the resources to the provinces, right? So it will be difficult to distribute the royalties without changing the constitution, I think. So finally, if you were to distribute the vaca muerta royalties among 24 provinces, the take of each province wouldn't be that big, right? I mean, unless it really becomes huge, right? But if it grows to 3 or 4 times what it is today, which I think is reasonable to think about that, and then maybe Argentina will produce maybe 2, maybe 3 million barrels, that would be like 4 or 5 times more than we produce now, roughly what Brazil produces now. You know, that would be a significant amount of money, but divided by 24 provinces, not that much. And some of these provinces already are collecting their own oil revenue. So for these reasons, I think horizontal conflict is less likely. But of course, I may be wrong.
May I just add a little aspect to the question? Because in Edward Gibson's book, I don't know how updated this is, Argentina is regarded as the country with the biggest malapportionment in the world. And my impression was that the power was biased toward the northern provinces, while the oil wealth is in the southern provinces. Do you think that would have any effect on whatever dispute may arise?
Yes, I think that's an interesting point you bring up, because I didn't mention this, but the southern Patagonian provinces with oil tend to be rich. They're relatively rich, partly because they have oil. In many ways, they are like Emirates, right? They are territories with relatively big reserves of oil and few people. So when you do the per capita, they're and they have other resources. You know, they have fishing, tourism. So while the northern provinces are poorer and tend not to have oil, they tend to have mineral resources, some of the northern provinces. So the provinces that have copper and lithium are provinces like San Juan, La Rioja, Catamarca, Salta, Jujuy, which are to the north, west and northwest, I would say. And then we have the northeast provinces, which are poor in both resources. No, they don't have oil or mineral resources. They're more agricultural provinces. And yeah, I guess there might be something there, right, regarding, you know, my previous argument would not apply to a few provinces in northeast, like, just to mention names, Corrientes or Chaco, that are relatively poor and small and won't lose anything from royalties, because they don't collect any royalties to this day. So they might join some kind of coalition against Neuquén, right? So to obtain the resources. But again, you have to see if the other provinces don't have the power to block. I think, let me just add one more political economy consideration, which is, it looks like this may be obvious from a theoretical point of view, but even inductively, you can tell in Argentina that ruling elites, like governors and ruling parties in provinces, are very interested in fiscal resources, right? They want their revenues and they want their money, and that's very, very important for them. And royalties in mining and oil provinces are a very significant resource. So I think the defensive coalition, you know, would be important, and therefore it would be difficult to get through. But yeah, there might be conflict, right, between those, especially those provinces in northeast. If you had to make predictions from the resource endowment, yeah, those provinces have can only win from a redistribution of the royalties, right? At this point, the topic is not politicized at all. It's not politicized at all. I mean, it's even surprising to what extent nobody talks about this. But you know, issues become politicized in unexpected ways, so it might happen.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a question to Daniel. Daniel, how federal and provincial political parties position themselves in relation to oil production and environmental protection?
Thank you very much. So yes, when you talk about political parties in Canada, so at the, in Canada, federal and provincial parties are, they are not really aligned on many issues. So it really varies a lot from one province to the next. So if we take just federal parties to start, so on the left of the political spectrum, you have the New Democratic Party. And this party is really emphasizing environmental policy in the fight against climate change, and much more critical of the oil industry. Then on the right of the political spectrum, you have the Conservative Party of Canada, the Conservatives, and they tend to be a much more pro-oil and natural gas. They do emphasize the fight against climate change, but it's much less central to their party platform, and they think that the economy should come first, as the priority over the fight against climate change to a certain extent. They don't always say that so openly, but that's basically what the basic idea is. In the middle, we have the Liberal Party of Canada, which is, of course, in power with Justin Trudeau. It's a center-left government. And I think here it's a kind of balancing act for them. Clearly, they are the strongest politically in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, where the fight against climate change is more of a priority. Then in Alberta, where in the last federal election, they only won 2 seats. And they have no seats in Saskatchewan at all. So the Liberals are really underrepresented in the 2 largest oil-producing provinces. And that is creating tensions between the Liberal federal government and these provinces, which are governed by right-of-center parties and have no or very few Liberal MPs at the federal level. Now, when we look at the provinces, the political parties, it varies a lot. So in Alberta, there is a New Democratic Party, but it's much more pro-oil than the federal New Democratic Party, or the New Democratic Party in British Columbia, where oil is not a major part of the economy. And I think that what's important to understand about this is that in Canada, there is a clear partisan debate over the balance that we need to strike between the economy, including oil exploitation, and the fight against climate change. The Conservatives are more on the side of the economy and the energy industry, and the NDP on the side of the fight against climate change. And the Liberals, I would say, are closer to the NDP, but at the same, because they want to steal their voters, and they are more left-leaning center party under Justin Trudeau. So they don't see much hope for them to get conservative voters to vote for them, especially in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan. So they focus on left-leaning voters in big cities like Montreal and Toronto. And these people really care a lot about the fight against climate change. So clearly, it emphasizes that, which creates tensions with provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan that are much more conservative and pro-oil.
Well, thank you. It's interesting because this issue has been resounding across Latin America as well. You have Petro in Colombia decided to close new oil enterprises, and we have in Brazil the Equatorial margin, which is a hot topic here. Well, thank you. We have one question to João Vitor as well, and the question affirms that the oil sector to Brazilian states like Rio de Janeiro is very important. And the question is how state government has been dealing with oil-related issues such as prices volatility. And if you see any new vectors for economic diversification in oil-producing states, which is a very important topic as well.
Thank you, Beni. That is a good question. we know that Rio is a vulnerable producing state because due to the oil prices volatilities and would be wrecked by a change in the distribution governance of oil rents. And now political discussions on increasing oil and gas revenues to non-producing jurisdictions would damage Rio's budget. So producing jurisdictions would even be more compromised or strained by ups and downs of the oil prices dynamic. As Rio is responsible for most of Brazilian oil production, a change in this governance perhaps would make the state to levy on more taxes on oil and gas companies, and perhaps hampering the production and for all the country. So one alternative would be to easy regulatory framework for fostering production in other places in the country. Now we have the discussion about the equatorial margin that has environmental license grievance between and the government that would foster productions in the northern region in Brazil. So this would represent an opportunity for diversifying oil production in the country. But talking about how Rio has dealt with this, with the volatility of oil, some municipalities like Niterói has an equalization fund. This is a revenue equalization fund which saves like 10% of the special participation payments, and it allows per year 20% of this total resources. And in case of estimated transfers be frustrated, 50% of that can be withdrawn. And talking about new vectors for diversifying the economy of oil-producing states and municipalities, we know that Brazil has a huge potential on renewable sources and for energy transition. In Rio, especially, the government has talked about potential to increase the production of natural gas that has the opportunity to make the energy transition on this on the industry in Brazil. And we have also other sources like biogas and biomethane that that is also an opportunity for having sources from the sanitation and agriculture waste. And also offshore wind that has a synergy with the oil and gas sector in Rio that could be complement to the oil and gas sector producing renewable energy.
Well, thank you. I think we have no more questions. I don't know if the authors would like to add something to what's been said. In my part, it was a really interesting and very challenging session in the terms that I could get in touch with some new developments in the countries that we actually visited a few years ago. Would you guys like to add something? Okay. So I think we are done. Thank you very much again. I hope we have the opportunity to develop more works together. Okay.
Thank you, Beni. Was
Thank
a
you
pleasure.
very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Ciao.